This is a family and a massive corporation that quietly influences your daily life in ways you probably never even realized. We're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most secretive and honestly most influential empires in modern American history. Let's just start right here. I want you to ask yourself, who actually controls your internet connection? Who determines the price of the car you're driving? And who curates the local news you read every single day? You're probably picturing a dozen different tech giants or media conglomerates, right? Well, what if I told you that for millions of Americans, the answer to all three of those questions is the exact same singular, unnamed power structure? Crazy, right? We are talking about a $50 billion shadow empire. $50 billion. And here's the real kicker about that massive number. This entire empire is privately held. There's no stock ticker to watch, no quarterly earnings calls for us to snoop on, and zero accountability to public shareholders. They operate with absolute control and near total invisibility.
All right, Section 1, the $26,000 presidential beginning.
The trajectory here is literally incredible. It all starts way back in 1898 with a 28-year-old schoolteacher named James Middleton Cox. He buys a struggling local newspaper, the Dayton Evening News, for just 26 grand. But James Cox wasn't just some local businessman. He was incredibly ambitious politically. Get this, by 1920, he actually ran for president of the United States, and his running mate, none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, they ended up losing that race pretty badly to Warren Harding, but Cox didn't just fade away. He used those high-level connections to pivot. Through the generations, especially under Jim Kennedy in 1988, who totally exploded their revenues, that initial $26,000 investment morphed into today's $50 billion mega monopoly.
Moving on to Section 2, a shadow corporate empire.
So how does a century of history translate into the power they hold right now? Well, take a look at this number, 6.3 million. That is the sheer volume of customers currently relying on their telecommunications wing. We're talking about Cox Communications. They are America's third largest cable and internet provider. If you happen to live in the South or the Midwest, there's a really high probability that Cox completely controls your connection to the outside world. They are the ultimate gatekeepers for the internet, TV, and phone services for millions of households. But listen, they don't just own the information pipes. Now, this is where it gets truly unbelievable. Let's look at their market dominance in a completely different sector, the automotive industry. 3 out of every 4. Under the umbrella of Cox Automotive, they own platforms you definitely use, like AutoTrader and Kelley Blue Book. But they also own Manheim, which just so happens to be the world's largest wholesale auto auction. By controlling these platforms, Cox literally influences 75%, 3 out of every 4, car transactions in America. Think about that for a second. When you check a used car price, Cox likely set it. When a dealer buys their inventory, Cox likely sold it to them. And at every single step, they're collecting and selling massive amounts of consumer data to dealers and advertisers. They essentially run the entire American car market from behind the scenes.
Okay, Section 3, the bloodline and the black sheep.
So James Cox's massive power passed primarily down to his daughters, Anne Cox Chambers and Barbara Cox Anthony. Through this incredibly complex, absolute genius maze of trusts, these two sisters managed to consolidate 98.8% of the entire company. You have nearly absolute control over a $50 billion pie resting entirely in the hands of 2 women and their immediate bloodline. It totally insulates a company from any outside democratic control. The whole setup was perfect, right? It ensured generational wealth and quiet, steady control. But every dynasty has its wildcards. So what actually happens when a member of that inner circle looks at this capitalist empire they're set to inherit and just walks away? Enter James Fergie Chambers. He is Anne Cox Chambers' grandson, and he was squarely in line to inherit an estimated 17% stake in Cox Enterprises. The catch? Fergie is a self-proclaimed communist. His ideologies are the exact opposite of the massive corporate entity his family spent a century building. The breaking point finally came over a controversial police facility in Atlanta, built by the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, which critics have widely dubbed Cop City. When Fergie found out that Cox Enterprises was putting $10 million toward funding this facility, he was absolutely furious. He went public, calling his family's funding a betrayal of everything decent. So in a completely unprecedented move for this fiercely private family, Fergie struck a deal in 2023 to totally sever ties. He sold his shares back to the family. Now, because of super strict non-disclosure agreements, we don't know the exact total, but reports indicate he walked away with a minimum estimated payout of $250 million. And what he did post-payout is just surreal. He immediately took that new liquid wealth and funded the exact causes his family opposed. He paid $60,000 to the Vote to Stop Cop City referendum on the exact same day his bank transfer cleared. He founded a leftist group called the Baba Chiki Collective, funded legal fees for arrested protesters, and even traveled to the Donbass region acting as a pro-Russia journalist. Oh, and adding to this bizarre web of connections, years prior, back in 2012, Fergie actually owned a gym where his employee was Marjorie Taylor Greene, long before she became a far-right congresswoman. It is just a massive, unprecedented ideological fracture within one of America's richest families.
All right, Section 4, the $34.5 billion duopoly.
Let's jump to May 2025, when a mind-blowing mega merger was announced. Charter Communications, you probably know them as Spectrum, agreed to buy Cox Communications for $34.5 billion. The financial mechanics here are just staggering. Cox Enterprises gets $4 billion in cash, $6 billion in convertible preferred stock, and roughly $11.9 billion in Charter shares. So after the deal fully closes, Cox Enterprises is going to own 23% of this newly combined giant. But here is the real kicker. Within a year of closing, the entire combined corporate entity is actually changing its name to Cox Communications, and fourth-generation heir Alex Taylor will become the chairman of the board. What this move creates is a massive broadband duopoly in America, basically splitting things between Charter, Cox, and Comcast. It means less competition, way more control, and the Cox corporate name lives on right at the very top.
Finally, Section 5, the art of invisibility.
So look, with $50 billion, total control over our internet, absolute dominance in the auto industry, and this new massive telecom duopoly, why does almost nobody know who the Cox family actually is? We are so used to loud public billionaires, right? Elon Musk is always tweeting. Jeff Bezos is buying super yachts. The Koch family is out there openly funding massive political campaigns. But the Cox family? They employ a very different strategy: complete, intentional invisibility. They just don't do interviews. They have no public social media profiles. You won't see them at high-profile summits like Davos. They operate quietly and ruthlessly efficiently from the shadows. And there is a very specific structural reason they're able to stay out of the headlines. They literally own the media that should be holding them accountable. Think about it. Cox Media Group owns television stations, radio stations, and major newspapers like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Their media arm reaches 52 million Americans every single week. It creates this chilling reality where the actual infrastructure of local journalism is owned by the exact same corporate monopoly that investigative journalists would normally be scrutinizing.
It really is a beautifully constructed, century-old business model. They own the pipes that deliver your internet, they own the news that informs your worldview, and they own the platforms that harvest your data when you try to buy a car. Information is literally the most valuable currency in the modern world, and the Cox dynasty has perfectly positioned themselves as the quiet toll collectors on the highway of American information.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. In a society that is just completely obsessed with celebrity CEOs, loud tech bros, and flashy wealth, why do we so easily ignore the quiet family that actually controls the infrastructure of our lives? They've spent over a century perfecting the art of invisibility because they know a fundamental truth. True power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to control the connections. So next time you pay your Wi-Fi bill or read a local news story, take a second and ask yourself,